whole nother level, but still keep it ghetto. Whole nother level, but still keep it ghetto. Whole nother level.
Welcome to episode 15 of The Process of Hip Hop. I'm Brian Joseph, writer, blogger at theprocessofhiphop.com. And as always, it's all about the process. In today's interview segment, I'll be talking to Iz-Real. Iz-Real is the co-editor of Insomniac Magazine that has been providing quality hip-hop music and culture coverage since 1996. So let's get into it. Blogger.
I'd like to welcome to the Process of Hip Hop podcast, Insomniac Magazine's Iz-Real. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's happening, Brian? Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for being here.
No question.
Iz-Real, I wanted to start with you. Your magazine has been around for over 20 years, and I've actually remember reading the magazine way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I remember. But take me back to prior to the 20 years. What got you into hip-hop, and what was the inspiration behind wanting to start a hip-hop magazine?
Yeah, well, I don't think you have enough time for that one, but I'll give you a condensed version.
Okay.
Yeah, so I am from the Bronx. More specifically, I'm from the Sound View section of the Bronx, which is where the Bronx River Projects are, and many people know that in many ways that was for lack of a better description, ground zero for the culture of hip-hop. So, as far as getting into hip hop, to be quite frank, I never remember getting into it because it was always around. It was almost like, you just grew up with it. And in many ways, the older kids, there were still kids, I guess, on the block, were in many ways the founders of the culture, So as a kid, I got to see people like Bambaataa and go to the parties in the park and see, people like DJ Red Alert and just about everybody who was anybody during that time. And that was probably my, first recollection of hip hop, other than obviously being surrounded by breakdancing and graffiti and all that kind of stuff. And then at the age of 16, after recording for a while, I signed my first record deal with a label that at the time Boogie Down Productions was signed to, and that was probably the beginning, if you will, of my foray into hip hop.
Was the genre, and I think a lot of people, especially that kind of grew up in the 70s, 80s, very similar to my experiences. I don't remember ever getting into it. It just kind of seems like it was always there. And I just became more aware of it as I got older. Reason I asked that question, because now we're dealing with a genre that there are people's defining moments for, hey, I started listening to hip hop,
right
at this certain age, or it was this song, or, a certain time period. So, hip hop was always, you were kind of immersed in it, very similar to my experience. What would you define, though, in terms of when you started the magazine? Because I remember the 90s was an explosion of hip hop magazines, so to speak. Obviously kind of led by The Source. You had Vibe magazine, but you had a lot of different magazines. So what made you want to develop a magazine about hip hop?
Right. So, well, basically, to be quite frank, ironically, my inspiration was actually The Source, but kind of in a opposite way. So, I was a diehard hip hop head, man. I always, from the beginning, I was always that kid, even back in the 80s, just going back for a minute, a lot of people that maybe aren't from that era and that time and that location, probably have an idea of hip hop, depending on what they've seen, maybe being a little bit like one of those 80s and maybe even early 90s movies that depicted, hip hop as an area that was really live and people breakdancing in the corner and openly, doing graffiti and rapping in the streets and all that kind of stuff. and clearly, there was some of that, but in reality, to be quite frank, it was urban blight. We were surrounded by a lot of crime. We were surrounded by burnt down buildings. We were surrounded by poverty, a lot of drug addiction. Heroin was out of control. Then crack came in, as an epidemic, and there was a lot of destitution. And in many ways, hip hop, as some folks know, it was the antidote to that, life that basically, could only end, unfortunately, a few ways, and most of those ways weren't going to be good for a youth without any kind of real resources, and maybe, a broken home, and possibly even drug addiction in the house, and, maybe siblings that were going the wrong way, and I checked most of those boxes, as a kid growing up. So, first things first, I guess I'll say that I always felt, because of, what hip hop was for me, a protector of the culture. So first, I was the kid that would always force everybody to listen to all this stuff, and 9 times out of 10 they didn't know what the heck I was letting them hear. But I would, if I got them in my room, if I got them by a radio, like, they weren't going to leave my clutches until they listened to tons of music, and then finally maybe sneak away. And when I got older and I started to see that hip hop started to take a little bit of a change, I became very vocal about what it was, where it came from, and what its purpose was. And I was an avid reader of the source. And I remember there came a point where I wasn't really happy with the fact that I saw, and this is not by any stretch of any imagination or disrespect to TLC, but I remember when TLC ended up on the cover. From my recollection, the previous episode, issue of the magazine, they would always tell you who was going to be on the next cover. And my recollection at the time was that it was going to be Ultramagnetic MCs. And I waited with bated breath for the next issue to come out. And when the issue came out, sure enough, I was really disappointed when TLC graced the cover. And again, nothing against TLC, but they weren't hip hop. They're still not hip hop. Not no diss to them. And the source was supposed to be the Bible of hip hop. So I honestly, sincerely took that to heart. To me, it was an offense on the culture. And I found, ways to write for different magazines at first, and eventually, after writing for different magazines and publications about hip hop and music, I launched Insomniac. But before that, I was actually doing radio. I was doing hip hop radio for about, when I started Insomniac, I was probably doing it for about 5 or so years, from the early 90s. So that was another, I left the Bronx actually when I was almost 20. And I started doing radio in the early 90s, and I moved down to Central Florida. And in Central Florida, there really wasn't any, what I consider to be real hip hop. So I started a show that kind of played, that played real hip hop, and mm-hmm. I would dare to say that it was the first all hip hop. There was another show that had started just before mine, but they played a little bit of everything. Again, nothing wrong with R&B, nothing wrong with dancehall reggae, but I was a hardcore hip hop head. So to me, I wanted a show that was just straight up, unadulterated hip hop, and I started that, and actually hosted it for the better part of a decade. And actually played most of the folks that would end up becoming legends and hip hop icons, and was the first one to play them in the market of Central Florida.
And you kind of brought us some interesting points, because again, born in the early 70s, mm-hmm. definitely was immersed in hip hop myself. And I mm-hmm. remember that when I was growing up, there was a part, I would say mid to late 80s, hip hop was definitely I'll just say it was a protected genre, so to speak, because mm-hmm. it was not pop culture at the time. I was somewhat frowned upon by the establishment in music. It was going to be something that was temporary. It's not going to be around. And then the 90s, the genre exploded.
No question. I think, in many ways that was yeah, you're right. I mean, it was one of those things that hip hop was like the stepchild of music. And obviously, as anyone that either studies or been around long enough knows, that it wasn't being acknowledged by the award programs, and people literally said that's not real music. But when it became when it started to become, more mainstream, it quickly shifted, from this, very diverse, eclectic sound to fairly quickly to a much more gangster sound, with the proliferation of West Coast, gangster rap after NWA blew up. So, I think hip hop had that window of time that became, for lack of a better description, discovered by mainstream America, and then quickly, kind of went into this mode where it became a caricature of what it was. And in some ways, I don't think, we haven't really fully recovered from that 30 years later or whatever. It's interesting.
Now, when you talk about kind of the birthplace of hip hop and it being Bronx, and, specifically, and I'm, thinking of New York City being that mecca of hip hop, I myself being a West Coast native, Los Angeles native, and I remember 1580 K-Day being that station for myself, my friends. Actually, we would record, you'd record the actual Greg Mack attack, and because that'd be the only way that you could hear hip hop, over and over again after the station was, or the program was actually off the air. What do you attribute, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but what do you attribute to I'll say, the bar of rap and hip hop being somewhat lowered as you got into the mid to late 90s, and definitely where we are today? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it was basically because it went from being this outcast, this thing on the fringes, in many ways kind of like fringe art and culture, to becoming something that was going to be exploited by major corporations, and when the big labels realized that this thing was here to stay, that there was certainly a lot of viability in this genre, I think that was the beginning of its, the demise of its purity, in the sense that, it wasn't just about it wasn't just about art. It wasn't just about its original purpose, which really was the salvation of inner city youth. And it was about exploitation, and, the lowest common denominator is going to get the most eyeballs or the most ears. And that became, this, like I say, in many ways, and I'm not, as a side note, I'm not by any stretch of any imagination, disrespecting the pioneers of that sound either. It's just that, it became a situation where the road to as many eyeballs and ears as possible was going to be, exploiting things that have shock value. And that's when the balance, shifted from, if you go back to at least the beginning of professionally released recordings, and you go back and you listen to folks like, Grandmaster Flash and The Message, and then, folks like Run DMC and the Beastie Boys and Mantronics, et cetera, et cetera. You just really have very diverse sounds. None of those folks, you could not, by any stretch of any imagination, even though they in some ways they kind of had some of the same vibe. You would never confuse, Melly Mel with DMC or, MCA from the Beastie Boys. You wouldn't be able to confuse Slick Rick from, Big Daddy Kane or KRS. And I think that's when in the late 90s and in the late 80s and early 90s was when the industry said, okay, so this is what's going to be that shortcut to get attention. And then they started to duplicate that. And, so again, not a disrespect to the people that came with that sound, but it was more so about the industry, finding a way to exploit the fact that people are going to react to things that are shocking. And Middle America, obviously isn't living that life. So what's the easiest way to get them enthralled is to, show them, the shoot 'em up, wild, crazy street life. And that was kind of the beginning. In my opinion, that was the beginning of how we got into that rut of less diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean sound, the diverse sounds, diverse, subject matter in hip hop.
I remember a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I remember Chuck D saying something to the effect of Black Death is very profitable. And that always stuck in my mind. He's basically talking about how violence in hip hop lyrics were, whenever you had that, it was one of the more successful type albums when you had violent lyrics that were talking about that specific type of activity. It was very profitable. So it became something that record executives and A&Rs began to try to, in some way, shape, or form, take current hip hop artists and change your style you're going to be a gangster rapper, because they saw how Middle America and other parts of the country were buying it. Just like, again, you talked about NWA earlier. It's like, yeah, there was a lot of non-black youth that bought NWA that had never even been to a ghetto. It's almost like it was part of what became hip hop. That phenomenon was that subgenre of hip hop became really the thing that made it commercial, and it was all about things that kind of over exaggerating, not any disrespect to the violence that is happening in inner cities all over the country, but it was at some time definitely like an over exaggerated. Let's be, as I kind of think of the Chris Rock CV4 movie, where it's he kind of spoofed that. It was similar type situation. So here's something else I'd like to ask you now.
But just to touch on that for 1 minute, everything you said I think was on point. The other thing I would add is that what was detrimental was that, unlike watching, because this is a comparison that folks have made, unlike watching a horror movie or I don't know, Friday the 13th, where everybody knows that this is Hollywood, right? And everyone knows that stuff is made up. Now, that doesn't mean, I know there's always folks that are going to take things to the extreme. That doesn't mean that there's not some crazy serial killer out there that's done those things. What I am saying is that wasn't a way of life, right? Like, that was a scary story. On the other hand, this was, kids' lives, and it wasn't, in some ways, it wasn't by choice. So I think that's where it became a detriment, was that you were, playing with people's perspectives about how to live life, and also glorifying those decisions. And again, it's not about being some Puritan. It's really about balance. The balance kind of started to kind of leave. And instead of having, someone like, again, a Cold Crush Brothers, or let's say Run DMC, You're Blind, talking about what, the death that was surrounding you and around you, and the perils that were, that young kids were facing, and to open your eyes and, make the right decisions. You started to have the glorification of making the wrong decisions. And of course that coupled with, perpetrating stereotypes for folks that didn't know any better, just because that's what they saw. So that's what they believed everybody maybe that came from that area was like. And it really, I don't know. You mentioned CB4. The other one was Fear of a Black Hat. It became a parody.
Yeah.
It became
Right.
a parody of itself.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I'll use Jay-Z, arguably the most successful rapper of all time, arguably, but someone who is definitely still very much respected by pure hip hop heads and the establishment. But what would you consider him a pop artist? Or would you consider him a true hip hop artist? And the reason why I ask that is because some people immediately they'll say, and again, I've heard people say that about him. Well, he kind of sold out, or now he's doing this, or
Mm-hmm.
what do you consider a hip hop sellout?
Yeah, that's a question that would be really difficult for me to answer, because I think, unfortunately, we have hip hop in many ways is like rock and roll, in the sense that once upon a time we had rock and roll, we had blues, and then we had rock and roll, and then from rock and roll we had rock, and we had hard rock, and we had punk rock, and new wave rock, et cetera, and it became this massive umbrella. I think the problem, that I have anyway, is maybe what people perceive to be hip hop, which to me is almost always going to be is going to be inherently tied to the original tenets of that culture and sound that included creativity. When I say positivity, I don't mean like some goody two shoes thing. I mean like really, a way to escape all of the negativity around you, and also lyricism and diverse sounds, because obviously hip hop was created from just about every genre of music. And what happened was the term hip hop and the idea that this is hip hop became kind of an umbrella for everything, So I think maybe, and maybe it's semantics, but if you are a hip hop purist, if you know your culture, if you know where it came from, then you know what hip hop is, and you know what rap is, and obviously, KRS-One is the one that kind of made that definitive kind of separation between the two. When he says this is something you live, this is something you do. Speaking the latter, speaking to rap. So rap is really the umbrella. Rap is really the umbrella. People are delivering, vocals in a specific way, and hip hop is, in many ways, a genre unto itself, and rap is this bigger umbrella that has everything, So whether you want to call it cloud rap, mumble rap, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that most folks, believe that hip hop is now these things that are void of lyricism, that are void of intricate production, diversity in production, and, is, in some cases kind of like nursery rhyme rap. So, it's hard to say, if someone is selling out, if they don't even know the difference. I think that's the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is that, selling out means that you were once real, and then you made a decision, to kind of sell your soul, if you will, for, visibility, fame, whatever you want to call it, riches, notoriety. But people don't even know. Like kids today making music, whether you call it hip hop or not, they don't know what hip hop is, most of them, and that's another problem, is that for some reason the culture, the history of the culture has become disposable and dispensable, unlike other genres. To this day, people that are learning music, kids that are learning music, could tell you about, the blues. That's
Yes.
the origin story. And with hip hop, man, if you go further back, for most folks, past 5 years in this history of, decades, then you pretty much lost them. So it's hard to say. Sellout is, if we would have went back, maybe to the beginning, we could have had a conversation that I think was a little bit more definitive. But now it's like, are you really selling out if you don't even know what you're making, and people are just labeling it hip hop?
And it's also interesting because you look at from a historical standpoint, Well, your titans of hip hop, we're not interested. Your Grandmaster Flash, Bambaataa, Herc, we're not interested in really doing commercial type hip hop, commercial music. They were kind of talked into it over time, and I'm talking about obviously the Furious Five, Grandmaster Flash. Obviously, the message is a similar rap song, but that's not something that occurred right away. That was something that he over time had to be talked into. And then ironically, he's not even really featured on that song the way you would think someone would be. But the other thing I think that's interesting, I'm looking at a social tweet from you, and I thought it was so interesting, very telling. You said the whackness is at epidemic proportions in the current rap era. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Well, again, if you know what hip hop is, you know that hip hop has certain tenets, and those are number one, don't bite, right? Like, don't be like somebody else. There's so many artists that you really their instinct is to copy someone else, and once upon a time that was inherently a no-no. Lyricism,
Cardinal
obviously.
sin.
Yeah, lyricism, obviously. You weren't going to grab a mic and drop corny, whack raps that, sounded like a preschool rhyme. It just wasn't something you were going to do. And it's pretty much the norm for the most part. So, I think, and the sound, right? I mean, once upon a time, just going back to that era, if you think about the variety of sounds that they drew from to create, original hip hop, when you think about a group like Run DMC that had everything from Bob James, the Mardi Gras song, to their collaboration with Aerosmith, to, the early records where they were mixing in hard rock, to the more stripped down, dusted drums. There was a lot of different sounds and different ambiance in those tracks, and that's just one group.
Yes.
And, we could go to someone like Madtronics that was, it was like, to me, he's like the forefather of electronic music.
Yeah.
Someone like Houdini, who in many ways were like this hybrid of soul and funk, but they were hip hop. It wasn't like they were hip hop, but they had this much more adult oriented kind of vibe, but their music was as pure as anything. And then we get to a point where you have very simplistic drums. You have again, 808 is obviously a cultural, or it's a staple in the sound, but you have these beats that are they have the rolling hi-hats and the bass, the snare, and then very basic melody, and everything kind of sounds the same. And I think that's probably, what I was referring to. I don't remember specifically what inspired that particular tweet, but yeah.
Well, even the term whackness is something that's so part of hip hop's DNA. That's whack. That's a term that, again, I'll say our generation really coined, and it was something that it meant had a lot of different connotations to it, but everyone knew what that meant. That was when something was whack. So I thought it was definitely something that was very much again appropriate and telling about that. So you've been around for more than 20 years. Where would you like to see the magazine? 1 to 3 years. Where would you like to see the magazine go?
Yeah, honestly, man, that's one of the things that hasn't really, I don't want to say evolved, but hasn't really changed. I mean, when I look back at the magazine, and I think about folks that we put, in the magazine and even on the cover of the magazine early on, people like, the Boot Camp Clique, who I probably would say we were the first ones to put them on a cover. I know I was lucky enough to get a clip of Sean Price basically giving props to Insomniac, saying that we were the first ones to put him on any cover. People early on like Gangstar and just tons of other folks that, maybe aren't household names that we put in the magazine when it was a paper magazine before anybody really paid attention to them. And today it's kind of interesting because I have, here we are, 20 some odd years removed from those, early days in the 90s. And you have, I call them kids, obviously, because I'm much older than they are, saying thank you for my first coverage, and that's a regular thing, and again, that kind of stemmed not even from the magazine, that really stemmed from radio, because not just me, also my co-editor Kevin Keith, we both did radio. He did radio before me, and I think he started in the late 80s and I started in the early 90s, and between the both of us, we were playing all these people in our markets. He was in New York, I was here at the time, and in Central Florida, and we were playing, people like the Wu-Tang Clan and people like Tribe Called Quest before anybody, or before most people even knew who those folks were in our markets, and that's saying a lot for him because he's from New York. Kevin Keefe and the Dirty Dozen was his show on 105.9. And so it was really back, starting back from those days on radio where it wasn't about playing whatever was hot. It was really about playing these gems that had yet to be discovered. And in some instances, those people became iconic. In some instances, maybe they, should have been legendary. But obviously, everyone knows that the music industry isn't fair. But that's always been our motivation, has been to kind of put a little light or put a spotlight on those artists that are coming with the goods, but, doing it before everybody, before they noticed, or in some cases, maybe they won't be noticed, if it wasn't for the spotlight.
For the listeners of this podcast, what's the best way for them to access the magazine if they've never have?
Yeah, so Insomniac Magazine is online, and basically it's insomniacmagazine.com. If that's too bulky to type, just type in hiphop.com, in hiphop.com. It goes to the same place. And obviously on social media, like everything else, at Insom since 96, Insom since 96 on Instagram and Twitter, and Insomniac Magazine on Facebook.
Well, Iz-Real, thank you so much for joining the process of hip hop, man. Best of luck to you and the magazine in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate that you reached out and given us this time to kind of share our origin story, and I want to give you a big salute for representing quality hip hop.
Thank you.
Peace.
We hope you enjoyed episode 15 of The Process of Hip Hop. Join us next week for our next episode. The Process of Hip Hop is produced and edited by me, Brian Joseph. Executive produced by Dale Harewood. Music by DJ Big Mike of Real Side Records at realsiderecords.com.